Imagine a country surrounded by endless ocean, scorched by deserts, filled with creatures that look like they were designed by nature to ruin your day, and populated by people who treat danger like a joke. That is Australia. Sure, it's famous for beaches, kangaroos, and barbecue, but what if instead of tourists showing up with sunscreen, someone tried to arrive with tanks, ships, and soldiers? What if a global superpower set its sights on conquering the land down under? Here's the truth. Invading Australia isn't just difficult. It's the kind of military nightmare that turns into a graveyard for strategies, supply chains, and egos. By the end of this breakdown, you'll see why any invader would regret the attempt, and why even world powers have looked at Australia and said, not worth it. Let's start with the most obvious problem, just getting there. Because before you even fight a single Australian soldier, the continent itself is already your first enemy. Geography and isolation. Australia is a true island continent. No land borders, no shortcuts. It's thousands of kilometers away from any major rival. To reach it, you either cross the Indian Ocean, the Pacific, or approach through Southeast Asia. None of these are friendly, calm waters. Storms, massive swells, and choke points like the Malacca Strait make long-distance military convoys extremely vulnerable. That means any invasion fleet would need to be enormous, not just with warships, but with supply carriers, fuel tankers, and logistics vessels. Every extra mile across the ocean stretches those lines thinner, and every ship in that convoy becomes a target. By the time you've even spotted the Australian coastline, you've already burned through resources just to keep your force afloat. But let's imagine you beat the oceans. You land. Congratulations, you've just unlocked the next boss level. And this one is called the Australian interior. Size and terrain. Australia is deceptively huge. On a map, it looks smaller than the United States, but that's just projection. In reality, it spans 7.7 million square kilometers, about the size of the continental US, with far fewer highways, railroads, or population centers. Once you leave the coast, most of the interior is unforgiving outback. Scorching heat during the day, freezing nights, dust storms, almost no natural water sources, and miles upon miles of nothing. Moving tanks, artillery, and supply trucks through that environment is a nightmare. Your soldiers aren't just fighting defenders, they're fighting dehydration, breakdowns, and terrain that eats equipment alive. Take Sydney, you're still thousands of kilometers away from Perth. Capture Darwin? Good luck pushing down into Melbourne. Every city is separated by wilderness that can cripple an army before it even meets an opponent. And if you think the environment is bad, wait until you meet the defenders who actually know how to fight in it. Australia's armed forces aren't the biggest in the world, but size isn't everything. The Australian Defence Force is small but modern, professional, and highly integrated with Western military technology. Air power, F-35 stealth fighters, long-range surveillance aircraft, and advanced drones give Australia control of the skies around its coastline. Navy, a fleet of powerful submarines lurks beneath the waves. Even a handful of these boats could shred supply convoys before they ever reach land. Army, specialized in mobile defense, trained to fight in both urban areas and the brutal bush. Here's the thing, Australia doesn't need to match an invader man for man. They just need to stretch you thin. With precision strikes, scorched earth tactics, and defensive depth, they could slowly bleed out any invading force. But if you think you're only fighting Australians, you're wrong. Because attacking Australia is like poking an entire alliance system in the eye. Alliances and global response. Australia is locked into some of the most powerful defense agreements on Earth. Through AUKUS, it's directly tied to the United States and the United Kingdom, both nuclear powers with global navies. Add in intelligence sharing from the Five Eyes network, with Canada and New Zealand, plus cooperation through the Quad Alliance with India and Japan, and suddenly one attack on Australia is an attack on half the democratic world. That means aircraft carriers, bombers, and nuclear submarines from allied nations would be racing to Australia's defense. The invading force wouldn't just face one military, it would face a coalition with overwhelming technological superiority and global reach. And even if somehow you got past geography, size, terrain, and alliances, you still haven't met Australia's wildcard. It's people. Australians have a reputation. They don't scare easily. This is a nation that jokes about deadly spiders, laughs at crocodile warnings, and casually tells venomous snakes to get out of the kitchen. Now imagine that attitude in a military occupation. You're not just dealing with soldiers, you're dealing with a population that prides itself on resilience and humor in the face of danger. Rural Australians already have firearms and off-road vehicles. Urban Australians already have strong community networks and a cultural streak of defiance. An invading army wouldn't find a passive civilian base. They'd find an unpredictable, stubborn resistance. One fueled not by ideology, but by the simple Aussie instinct to tell outsiders, "Not here, mate." And the terrain itself gives those civilians and defenders a powerful weapon: Australia's fragile infrastructure. Unlike Europe or North America, Australia doesn't have endless interstates or railroads connecting its cities. Most of the population hugs the coast, while the interior is mostly empty. That means supply chains depend on a handful of key highways, rail lines, and ports. Destroy just a few of these, and entire regions become cut off. Fuel can't move inland. Food can't reach bases. Your tanks and trucks stall in the desert, not because of enemy fire, but because there's simply no road left to drive on. The outback itself becomes a silent ally of the defenders. It cooks your troops by day, freezes them by night, and swallows your equipment in dust storms. In other words, the land itself fights against you. And this isn't just theory. History already tested the idea, and even some of the most aggressive powers backed away. During World War II, Japan was at its peak military strength in the Pacific. Its navy dominated the seas, its air force was feared, and it had already occupied large chunks of Asia. Yet when Japanese planners considered invading Australia, the answer was clear: too risky, too costly. Instead of a full invasion, they settled for bombing Darwin and launching submarine raids on Sydney Harbor. Even with Australia's military weaker at the time and its alliances thinner, Japan saw the task as impossible. If Japan, a regional power at its height, wouldn't commit, why would anyone today think it could be done? But let's imagine for a moment that someone ignored history and tried anyway. Let's run the simulation. Picture this. A powerful nation mobilizes a massive fleet. Dozens of warships, carriers, transports, and supply vessels move south through the Pacific. The target? Northern Australia, perhaps Darwin, with its long coastline and relatively sparse defenses. At first, it looks promising. Troops hit the beaches, a port is captured, and banners are raised. But within hours, the problems multiply. Air scramble. Australia's radar and satellite systems detect the approach long before landing. F-35 scramble, submarines reposition, and long-range missiles lock on to the invaders' ships. Supply crisis. Even if the first wave lands, keeping them supplied is a nightmare. Heat, lack of water, and ambushes along highways bleed resources faster than reinforcements can arrive. Civilian chaos. Local militias strike at night, infrastructure is sabotaged, and entire towns become hostile fortresses. Allied arrival. Within days, American and British carriers move in. Bombers take off from Guam, Diego Garcia, and even the U.S. mainland. Cruise missiles rain down on captured ports. Very quickly, what looked like a victory turns into a quagmire. Troops trapped inland can't move forward. Convoys at sea are hunted by submarines. Commanders realize they're bleeding lives, fuel, and equipment just to hold a patch of coastline. The invasion begins to collapse, not with one decisive battle, but with slow, grinding exhaustion. And that's the real nightmare. Not a dramatic defeat, but a drawn-out disaster with no way to win. Invading Australia isn't just a bad idea. It's a recipe for strategic humiliation. Geography, climate, distance, alliances, military tech, and civilian resistance all combine into one giant fortress. It's not built of walls and castles. It's built of deserts, oceans, and a culture that refuses to break. That's why, in every serious analysis, Australia comes out as one of the hardest nations on Earth to conquer. If you try, you don't just risk losing, you risk being swallowed whole. So if you're thinking about Australia, don't bring an army. Bring a surfboard. Take a selfie with a kangaroo. Try not to step on a venomous snake. It's far safer that way. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this breakdown, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment on which country's defenses we should explore next. Until then, remember, never underestimate an island continent that once lost a war to emus and still came out tougher for it.